Rain had been falling all evening. Drops tapped softly against the glass, and Peppa Pig's house was wrapped in a grey twilight. Peppa and George sat on the floor, stacking colourful blocks into a tower. Everything seemed ordinary, until the front door slammed shut. "Daddy? Mummy?" Peppa called. No answer. Only the sound of wet footsteps echoed through the hallway. Peppa stood up and peeked into the living room. Her parents were standing by the door. At first glance, they looked the same, but something was wrong. Mummy Pig was smiling, yet the smile was frozen, like it had been painted on. Her eyes were dark, without reflection. Daddy Pig moved too smoothly, as if his body slid rather than walked. A chill ran down Peppa's back. "You got wet?" she asked quietly. Daddy Pig tilted his head. Too far, then farther, and farther still, until it turned completely around. Peppa stepped back, clutching George. Mummy Pig took a step forward, her body bending unnaturally, as if her bones had turned soft. "Mummy?" George whispered. The answer was a low rasp, almost laughter, but without joy. Peppa grabbed George's hoof and ran upstairs. The boards creaked beneath them, as though the house itself tried to hold them back. The bedroom door slammed shut, and Peppa turned the key. Downstairs, silence returned. Only the rain outside and their quick, frightened breathing. Then came the first sound, a long, scraping noise, like claws on wood. Something was dragging a paw along the door. Then a whisper. At first, faint and muffled, then closer, until it sounded as if voices were speaking right through the keyhole. The shadows on the walls began to move. They pulsed and shifted, changing shape as if alive. One stretched to the ceiling and started crawling toward the bed. Peppa pressed George against herself, eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder. The wood groaned under the weight of unseen claws, and suddenly the darkness burst into two blazing eyes. Fiery yellow, unblinking, they pierced the room like light through smoke. From the blackness emerged a massive owl. Its wings were spread wide, its talons long and sharp, its gaze cold and intelligent. It tilted its head, and its hoot sounded like a deep, mocking laugh. The windows rattled from the sound. Peppa shielded George, feeling the owl's shadow stretch across the walls. The creature moved closer to the door, slowly, deliberately. Every touch of its talon left a mark, deep scratches that seemed to melt the wood. The owl leaned toward the keyhole. In the silence came the sound of breathing, heavy and rasping. "Pe, a voice whispered. She couldn't tell whether it was the owl speaking or something else entirely. The door trembled, first gently, then stronger. It seemed ready to crack. The shadows on the walls gathered together, pulling toward a single point. The whole room shivered, and then it stopped. Total silence. Only the rain remained. Peppa didn't move for a long time. Finally, she crept to the door and pressed her ear to it. Nothing. She exhaled slowly and turned to George. He sat motionless, staring into the corner of the room. Peppa followed his gaze and saw it. On the floor, beneath the window, in a small puddle of rainwater, was a single claw print. Outside, the forest loomed dark. Something moved among the trees. Peppa squinted and saw a shape, tall, with vast wings spread wide. It stood silently on a branch, watching. The owl had not left.
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
Morning in the Pig family's house began as usual. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, and George was rolling on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything was calm until Peppa appeared. Something about her was different. She walked slowly and confidently, with an expression that clearly said, "I'm above all this." That morning, Peppa had decided she was no longer just Peppa. She was a Sigma. She didn't sit at the table. She simply stood and watched her family eat. Mummy offered her porridge, but Peppa refused. Porridge was for ordinary pigs. A Sigma feeds on self-discipline and purpose. After breakfast, Peppa strolled through the house and decided that a true Sigma must be in control of everything. She sat down in the living room, opened a small notebook, and wrote, Day 1. A Sigma never seeks approval. A Sigma observes, but does not participate. George tried to get her to play, but Peppa stayed silent. She simply watched him build a tower of blocks and thought about serious things, independence, focus, and the meaning of life. When George knocked his tower down, Peppa just nodded. That's why Sigmas don't play. Emotions are the enemy of concentration, she thought. Daddy Pig tried to distract her. He showed her the TV, invited her to the garden, but Peppa didn't give in. A Sigma doesn't waste time on noise and chaos. She sat on the windowsill, looking out into the distance as if searching for a greater purpose. Mummy Pig watched her with a smile. Peppa wasn't running, jumping, or laughing. She was simply thinking. Sometimes she would pace slowly through the house, pretending to be deep in thought. Sometimes she would write cryptic phrases like, "True strength lies in solitude," and "The Sigma never argues, she is simply right." By lunchtime, Peppa was still keeping her image. When Mummy placed soup on the table, Peppa sighed. It smelled far too good for someone practicing self-control. She hesitated for a moment, then ate it all. Even a Sigma needs energy for her mind, she told herself, marking it down as an exception for mental focus. After lunch, she kept training her inner strength. She didn't join family conversations, didn't laugh at Daddy's jokes, and didn't even react when George showed her his new drawing. But by evening, her resolve began to fade. Daddy Pig brought out a board game, Mummy poured tea and served pie, and George was giggling on the carpet. The house felt warm and cozy. Peppa sat apart, trying to maintain her serious look, but the smell of pie was stronger than philosophy. She walked to the table and quietly sat down. Daddy poured her some tea. Mummy smiled. Peppa took a deep breath and decided, a Sigma can enjoy pie. Balance is everything. Soon she was laughing with the others. No theory could compete with the comfort of a family evening. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, Peppa sat by the window, thinking. Being a Sigma wasn't easy. It took strength, patience, and dessert. She wrote one last sentence in her notebook. A true Sigma knows. The most important thing is to be yourself, even if that self just loves to laugh. Peppa yawned, closed her notebook, and fell asleep, deciding that tomorrow she would become a Sigma again, but only after breakfast. Peppa Pig, the White Wolf, and Evie. A sense of unease settled over the pig household, something that no one dared to speak aloud. It all started subtly. The first few nights, Peppa would wake up to a strange sound. Maybe the wind was rustling in the trees, or perhaps claws were scraping across the floor. When she opened her eyes, it seemed like a shadow was moving in the corner of the room. But as soon as she blinked, the shadow was gone. One night, Peppa woke up with a sense of cold. Moonlight streamed through the window, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The white wolf. He stood still, head held high, his fur glowing in the dark as if he was woven from the very light of the moon. The wolf didn't growl or move. He just stared. His breath was heavy, burning cold. The next morning, Peppa told her parents, but they just smiled and said she must have dreamed it. Mummy Pig patted her on the head and said, "You were just scared of the dark." But deep inside, Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. With each passing night, the wolf's presence grew more insistent. At first, he glided across the walls as a shadow. Then his silhouette appeared by their bed. Peppa felt his breath touch her cheek. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of claws scraping the wooden floor. George would toss and turn in his sleep, mumbling, but when he woke, he couldn't remember anything. Then Peppa noticed that the wolf wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small crib by the wall where little Evie slept. Normally, the baby slept peacefully, but now she often cried in the middle of the night. Her tiny body trembled, and it seemed like she felt the presence of the wolf more than anyone. One night, Peppa saw the wolf's eyes glow red. He stood right by Evie's crib, his muzzle lowering towards her face. The baby suddenly woke up and cried, but his gaze never left her. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice stuck in her throat. She ran to her parents, but they were sleeping so deeply, as if they had been enchanted. Days passed, and Evie changed. She stopped crying at night, but that was even scarier. She lay still, her eyes wide open, and her face had turned pale, as if drained of life. When Peppa looked into her eyes, it seemed like they were empty, glassy, and the baby was staring right through her. Peppa tried to convince Mum and Dad that something was wrong, but they just shook their heads. Sometimes at night, she heard them murmuring in their sleep. The words were soft, but she could swear they were repeating the same whisper, a distant howl. "He's waiting! He's waiting!" Then came the morning that changed everything. Peppa woke up and saw that Daddy Pig's bed was empty. His glasses lay on the nightstand, and the blanket was neatly folded. On the pillow was a piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Don't search for me. I'm with him now." Mummy Pig read the note and turned pale. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply sat down on a chair and stared at the wall for a long time. George didn't understand, but Peppa felt a chill spreading inside her. That night, everything became clearer. The room was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The moonlight shone brightly, and its light fell directly on Evie's crib. There beside her sat the white wolf. His fur shimmered and his eyes glowed with a dull red flame. But the most terrifying thing was his smile, his muzzle twisted into a cruel, inhuman grin. Peppa stared at him, unable to move. The wolf wasn't in a hurry. He just sat next to Evie, as if waiting for her turn. Then his gaze slowly shifted to Peppa. She felt her heart tighten. In that moment, she understood. He would come for her too. The night was unusually quiet. Outside the window, there were no stars, no moon, only a dense darkness in which everything seemed to dissolve. Peppa Pig's house had fallen silent on its own. Even the kitchen clock had stopped ticking, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against their ears. Peppa woke up suddenly, as if someone had touched her shoulder. She sat up in bed and listened to George's breathing. It was too even, too quiet. Her brother slept, tightly clutching his dinosaur. But then, from the parents' room next door, came a sound. A low, drawn-out groan mixed with a creaking noise. Peppa held her breath. She hadn't wanted to wake George, but he opened his eyes himself and looked at her. His face was pale. He had heard it too. Carefully, they got out of bed and, trying to walk silently, stepped into the hallway. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker coming from under their parents' door. That was where the strange sound was coming from. Peppa squeezed George's little paw. The door was slightly ajar. She nudged it open just a little and peeked inside. What they saw froze their hearts. On the bed sat a creature that resembled their parents, yet was entirely alien. Its body looked as if it had been stitched from two halves. One part, Mummy Pig, the other, Daddy Pig. Two heads protruded side by side, but the eyes in both faces were utterly empty. They reflected no light, no life, only two bottomless black voids. Identical, wide smiles stretched across both faces. The creature turned toward the children, the two heads tilted at the same time. With that movement, the very air seemed to change pressure. It became harder to breathe. Peppa stepped back, but her legs refused to obey. George clutched her paw tightly, but he too seemed rooted to the floor. The creature stretched its arms toward them. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. The room reeked of dampness and rot. "Mama!" whispered Peppa. But in that moment she knew it was not their parents. Their bodies began moving on their own. Slowly, step by step, they walked toward the thing. Their hearts pounded, but there was no strength left to resist. The creature waited. Its two mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, but no sound came out. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. And then, from behind it, from the very shadow, he appeared. La Boo Boo. Peppa recognized his silhouette instantly, her favorite toy, the one that always sat on the shelf. But now, he was alive. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the dark, and on his face was a smile so wide and crooked it looked as though the fabric would split. In his paws, he held a doll. Small, ragged, and horribly familiar. A copy of Peppa herself. Even the dress was the same pink, only stained with dark blotches. Slowly, Labubu began to pull at the doll's head. The fabric stretched, and a sickening tearing sound filled the air. The two-headed creature immediately froze, as if awaiting orders. Its empty eyes were fixed on Labubu. It wasn't the master, it was the servant. "No," whispered Peppa, but her voice was too weak. George flinched, his small eyes widening. On the floor beside him lay another doll, an exact copy of George. It had appeared out of nowhere, and its lifeless eyes stared directly at the children. Labubu lifted his gaze. His red eyes met Peppa's. In that instant, she felt the world itself shift. The walls of her parents' bedroom quivered, the ceiling stretched higher, and the door behind her slammed shut on its own. There was no way out. The creature took a step forward, its two heads grinning in the same unnatural smile. But it wasn't moving toward the children. It was moving in rhythm with Labubu. Every tilt of his head, every twitch of his paw was mirrored by the monster. It was the puppet, and Labubu was the puppeteer. Peppa and George screamed, but their voices vanished, swallowed by the air itself. Labubu only smiled wider. He lifted both dolls, the Peppa doll and the George doll, and pressed them together. At that moment, the children felt their own bodies being dragged forward, pulled into the darkness toward the creature. The darkness closed in around them. Peppa had just enough time to see Labubu's red eyes blazing brighter than ever. And then the world was gone. The last thing that remained in her memory was his smile, and the realization that now they themselves had become part of Labubu's collection. An ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's house. Rain drummed on the roof, the wind pushed heavy clouds across the sky, and inside there was that same cozy silence that usually brought comfort. The family gathered in the living room. Daddy Pig leafed through his newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, George played with his dinosaur, and Peppa was building a tower of blocks. Everything looked normal, but Peppa couldn't shake off a strange sense of unease. She noticed it first. The light in the room flickered, the lamp dimmed for a moment, and the shadows on the walls stirred. At first it seemed like nothing more than the wind and the storm outside. But a minute later, the shadows changed again. They stretched longer than they should have and began to move on their own, no longer tied to the people in the room. "Something's wrong with the lamp," muttered Daddy Pig, getting up and fiddling with the switch. But the light burned steadily. Only the shadows moved freely. They twisted, intertwined, and became more and more distorted. Shapes appeared on the walls that shouldn't exist. Crooked arms with unnaturally long fingers, twisted faces, grimacing mouths. "Mummy," whispered Peppa. "It's fine, darling," Mummy Pig quickly replied, but her voice trembled and her hands shook so badly that the knitting slipped from her lap. George whimpered, clutching his dinosaur to his chest. Even his toy cast a shadow that twitched oddly, moving differently than the dinosaur itself, as if alive. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, and each tick thudded like a chill in Peppa's chest. The shadows kept growing, stretching toward the ceiling, the floor, the children. And then one of them separated. It swelled larger than the rest, filling half the room. Its shape was uneven, like smoke given form. Two red points flared where its eyes should be. The figure leaned forward, and from its mouth came a deep, drawn-out growl. "Daddy!" whispered Peppa. But Daddy Pig didn't move. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling, yet no words came. Mummy Pig gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. The creature advanced, its clawed arms stretched toward Peppa, reaching closer and closer. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. And then something stirred on the shelf. Labubu, his glass eyes lit up red. The toy that had always sat motionless suddenly came alive. Slowly, he jumped down. His tiny feet touched the floor softly, yet the sound echoed as if he were far heavier than he looked. He stood directly in front of Peppa. His smile widened, twisted, almost monstrous. The creature froze, its red eyes locked with Labubu's. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rain against the windows. Then, from Labubu's little hands, a stream of thick black energy burst forth. It surged toward the shadow creature, colliding with it like lightning. The air trembled, filled with the smell of damp earth and burning at once. The creature hissed, its body jerking violently, tearing apart piece by piece. It reached toward Labubu with its claws, but he only lifted his gaze, and his glowing eyes flared so brightly that Peppa flinched, nearly blinded. A piercing scream rang out, so sharp it rattled her ears. The shadow writhed, as if being ripped apart, and with a final hiss dissolved into nothing. The family sat in stunned silence. George no longer cried. He only clutched his dinosaur tightly, his eyes wide with terror. Mummy and Daddy Pig sat pale and shaken, unable to comprehend what they had seen. Labubu stood on the floor, his glowing red eyes slowly dimmed. His smile softened, turned back into its familiar, innocent curve. He looked once more like an ordinary toy, but Peppa knew he wasn't. She stared at him, feeling deep down that he hadn't just saved them. He had enjoyed it. His smile, even when gentle again, no longer looked harmless. The shadows on the walls never completely disappeared. They still writhed faintly, but quieter now, calmer, almost as if obeying something. Peppa turned to Labubu. He was already back on the shelf. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes faintly glimmering in the darkness, following the movements of every remaining shadow. And his smile widened just a little more. Peppa hugged George tightly and realized this wasn't over. It was only the beginning.
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing, like two glass orbs, no emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this. Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiero's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodile. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiero raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything.